Well, it looks like we have liftoff. You ready to go, Richard? Well, I'll begin your brief introduction in that case. Well, the organiser of the exhibition, so I think it's timely that, Richard, that we all give our thanks to you for organising the splendid... a splendid gathering, but now it's your turn to shine. And the background, Richard's background, is that, of course, we know he's the director of Carrick Hill, where he's worked, but he's worked for 20 years in historic houses and gardens, with a particular interest in architecture, social history, and the interpretation of gardens and their gardeners. His career also includes 10 years as manager of Ripon Lee in Melbourne. He's a curator, writer, broadcaster, garden historian, and general, and I didn't write this, man about town, in quotes. He's also a tire swan collector. You'll have to ask him about that later. As the founding director of the National Exhibition and Touring Agency, and that's where we first, our professional paths first crossed, he was responsible for touring to regional centres and organising exhibitions to the Venice Biennale, for instance, and the Indian Triennial. Before coming to Australia in 1979, so 33 years ago, he was an arts administrator who worked in community festivals and theatre. Richard's an active member of many societies and community groups, including Rotary. I think we had some of their wine the other night. A member of the Garden History Society and the Australian Bookplate Society. And he also leads specialist interest group tours of English houses and gardens. He was awarded a Churchill Fellowship and is a Nottingham alumnus, having attended both the summer school and the Royal Collections Study Week. He's also a trustee and chairman, most importantly, of the board of the Copeland Foundation. Richard's most recent publication is Carrick Hill, a portrait published by Wakefield Press last year. He's also a distinguished and accomplished speaker, but who must nevertheless be having some slight apprehension in case the episode of him going to Mount Gambier without any trousers is mentioned. But I wouldn't dream of it. And Richard's never afraid to court controversy. Richard is now going to talk about a strategy to attract more male visitors. Old Mole's Tools and the Shed-Driven Programme. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Andrew. I owe you one. We're going to try and overcome this catastrophe of my voice, having dealt with fire and earthquakes. So you'll forgive me if I sound a bit Eartha Kitt. Some of you might not know her. This session my talk is really about strategic programming. Strategic programming. Many of you, like me, have been on the treadmill of exhibitions, events, and activities. Once you're good at it, it's ceaseless. A ceaseless round. However well you did last year, you've got to do better this. And I'm not convinced it's actually the way forward. It's necessary in part. So when, on May the 10th, 2010, my beloved wife woke me at 7 a.m. with a mug of tea and the newspaper, she said, "Drink the tea first, dear. You're on the front page of the Murdoch rag." And as you'll see from the top right of this slide, we were to be sold. Sold. And when my boss, the Honourable Alex Reid, called at noon that day, not high noon, though it was for me, she said, "I'm very sorry, Richard, I was embargoed. And I thought it better, rather than to administer the death of 1,000 cuts, to simply say we could sell Carrick Hill as part of the sustainable budget programme of razor gang cuts." Thanks, Alex. I'll remember that. And then I actually thought, remember that moment between, let me get this right, between impulse and response. There's a little moment when you can decide what your attitude is, not very long. And I thought, I've got to be very careful now. I've been here 6 years, and we've worked so hard to build the credibility. What didn't we do? What didn't we do to convince the treasurer that we could be sold before breakfast? And he wouldn't blink. He wouldn't blink. Which public servant hadn't I convinced of our value? That was my response. Not, what a shit of a place to be in after 6 years' work. So I said to myself, Alex Reid is going to help me make adversity my ally. Because when I finished at Carrick Hill, even though they'd have to have an Act of Parliament to sell us, I don't want it to be in the consciousness of any senior bureaucrat, I'm just a middle-ranking public servant, that it will be on the cards to do it. That we will be so significant and valuable that it wouldn't be an option. They'd just have to sell Carclew House instead. So we had already started with our strategic planning. We'd done a visioning exercise. We were beginning to move towards a master plan. And I thought, you know, the one thing that politicians and bureaucrats understand is constituencies. We have a lot of supporters at Carrick Hill. We have a lot of patrons and donors, but we haven't advanced them up that terrible Maslin chart of progression to become constituents, to sign on so that if we're ever under threat, we have a weapon. Public opinion and personal commitment. How are we going to get that to happen? That was the issue. Now I've got the changer. Well, you heard yesterday the serious side of the business. If we haven't told the people in power that our collection is significant and our place is of substance in the national cultural life, and if we don't have some international recognition of that, how can we blame them for believing we're not just anything but, what's that wonderful phrase you used, James? Cat meat. We're just cat meat. It can be gotten rid of before breakfast. So we set to work, and you've heard about our recataloguing of the collection, which is actually a revaluing of the collection, which is to do with a statement of significance. We had a couple of false starts. We didn't get the grant to do the statement, and then we went another way, and we're hard on that track. But inside is only part of the story at Carrick Hill, as those that came along my little walk yesterday know. The outside is as important as the inside. How can I build a constituency there? A constituency that will actually speak to politicians and bureaucrats. Well, psychologist and social commentator Hugh Mackay told us more people garden in Australia than gamble. More people garden, they do it, than gamble. And we have a bit of a risk here, don't we? Which is, okay, how do we get gardening into our experience? You've heard Jane talk about, if you can have an emotional experience at the place, it actually binds you to it much more strongly. We have 60,000 visitors a year. 90% of them come essentially for the garden. Whether it's to drink a cup of tea on the terrace and look at it or out from it, whether it's to be part of a bridal moment. We don't have to use Roundup, James. We have the solution if we become a wedding business, because certainly the treasurer would have no compunction about selling us because we were too successful wedding business. You simply put the price up and the number of brides that come decreases, but you get the same money. So don't worry about the weddings. We'll fix the weddings. Of that 90% that come from the garden, the majority are women. You see them here. They actually are the main shoppers at nurseries. They're the main purchasers of what my friend Richard Aitken calls horto-porn. We know, we've sold them the books. They're also the people, the gardeners, who open their gardens under the open garden scheme. If you go to those, it's very seldom. There's a bloke somewhere in the background, but they're doing it. Okay, we'll put that aside. Let's talk about our garden. You all introduced to Ursula Hayward. She actually grew up at Birksgate, and here she is in her Lilium garden. Not a bad effort for a 6-year-old. I think she had some help. But she was passionate about cut flowers. She grew them throughout her garden. She put them throughout her house. And although she may not have chipped her nail varnish in the late afternoon before the cocktail party by actually doing a bit of weeding, she did get out there. She did choose plants. She did talk closely to her gardeners, and she valued them. Gardeners. In the great tradition, she's not quite Vita Sackville-West. She didn't write a weekly column for the Observer. She wasn't a plantswoman of any great standing, but she read and travelled, and she actually organised and laid out her garden. Sure, she's a bar smith. She could do it with a checkbook, second to none. But she also selected paintings that reflected this. So it's imbued the whole house with this, inside, outside. From those mullioned latticed windows, you see the garden framed. And Jane gave you some ideas about how we might use that concept later on. This was her most valued gardener. I've got to be very careful because his name is Cliff Jacobs, and of course we want to call him Clip Jacobs. He was a gardener for 45 years. From 1939, he saw Tom Shanks and his 2 strong sons with a pair of horses and a scoop actually cut out those terraces in front of the house before the dry stone walling was put up to retain them. He actually was there at the beginning. He saw the standard hawthorn planted as a yard-high tree. And he knew the last hurrah of gardening with hand tools. This was his whippersnipper, the lawn edger. My son-in-law's father worked at Eaton Park in Manchester. He did his indentured horticultural turn there, and this was the first tool he was given. Eaton Park has about 10 miles of lawn edge, and he said to the supervisor, "Where do I begin?" And he said, lad, anywhere you like." It's a beautiful thing, isn't it? Just look at it. Romance, nostalgia, sweat, guts, the real thing. It's quite sharp too. So Cliff, we're very lucky at Carrick Hill. We're one family, no children, and only really one generation of servants. And the working life of the house is of deep interest to people who come. We have to tell the story. We have to tell the story, particularly because there's Cliff in the middle. When the government took over, as they say, that is when Carrick Hill became a statutory body, 1983, Cliff was kept on, and John Draper, who's on the right, is now senior horticulturalist with the Burnside Council, was a young Turk sent up from the Botanic Gardens to get things moving so the Queen could open us in 1986 with everything looking trim, taut, and terrific. And the first thing that John said to Cliff was, "Tell you what, Cliff, I've got some mechanical clippers here. You don't have to go up the trellis anymore with your hand shears. This will do the job in half the time." And Cliff gave them a go for a few minutes and then handed them back and said, "No thanks, they're a bit noisy for me. I think I'll stick to the shears." And you know, when I walked up to the shed about the second month that Carrick Hill I was there, which is December 2004, I thought, I wonder if the lads have still got those old tools hanging around. And there were 3 pairs of clipping shears that were there in the original shed. They were relatively unused, so I said to Rob Long, who's been there the longest, I said, why? These are Cliff's shears, why are they like this? He said, "Oh, they're the ones he rejected. That's why they've survived. The ones he used ended up being like knitting needles, German steel. And so they were just right. They were the right tool. Sadly, we haven't got those. We got the rejects. So mechanical tools, the rotary mower, the whippersnipper, the blower, the ride-on mower had no part at Carrick Hill for 45 years. Cliff did it by hand. When you go to trust properties, they're not doing it by hand. And our hedges are now clipped by a team twice a year who come in, 5 of them, with electric clippers. And they don't get it even half as good as Cliff. This is our story. We can make it better. We know the tools that did the job. How can we do it? Well, now I have to introduce you to another man that's going to help us attract men. This is Old Mole, Richard Bird. He's run a small business since he retired as a geologist. And for the past 15 years, he's been collecting hand tools and importing them from England. He's very knowledgeable. He knows the history of every tool he buys, or some degree of it, and he researches. And I bought this from him from the Mount Gambier, when he was at the Mount Gambier Garden History Conference. It's a fork. And it's very similar to the fork that my father used to just give the beds a light lift and spruce up the soil before my 7th birthday, just outside Norwich in Brundall, in the village where I grew up. I remember him with clenched teeth and a cravat, rolled up sleeves on a quite grim May day, just getting ready on a Saturday for the party on Sunday, so I could wear my new cowboy outfit and my pistols against a background of roses and, you know, all those sorts of things. Now, I just had to have it. I saw it and I had it. And then when I got it home, I hung it in our dining room in Melbourne, and people used to look at it strangely. Strangely, Andrew. And he heard about it, and he got in touch. And he said, I hear you hang one of my forks in your dining room. And we became friends, firm friends. And he was trying to plan for his collection of, let me get it right, 762 garden tools and implements. He offered them to the Botanic Gardens, he offered them to the National Trust, he offered them to the Historic Houses Trust, but nobody could quite make sense of them. I'm pleased to say the Carrick Hill Trust has accepted this gift, which will be navigated through the Cultural Gifts Programme, which will give it another status, and it will become the core component of the Australian Gardening Museum. Now, don't let the title fool you. It'll be Old Mole's tools in a garden shed. But you know, committees and boards need grand titles. This is his shed in Armadale, or the prospect out of it. He was a geologist, as I said, and he has a very keen sense of analysing things, what they were used for and how. This is his shed. It burnt down the first time, and the collection with it, and he had to rebuild the collection. What a story! A catastrophe to a collector. This is sort of how he does it. This may not be how we do it, but it may be. We'll probably have some of those wonderful planopies of hand tools like rakes and hoes and cultivators and spades and forks, you know, like sort of Hampton Court, that great sort of repository of arms necessary to tack the garden, or we may not. But whatever it is, it will be a shed. Now there's a moment here, there's a fork in the road, not the fork I've shown you. And Yogi Berra, the famous baseball player, said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. So you've got to know where you're going. There's a big men's shed movement. This is not what we're aligning ourselves with, but it will be useful. Men's business. Blokes in caves. Could be useful, but it's to the side of what we're doing. Here's the Borough men's shed. But what is important is it's a shed. You see the shed? It's probably going to be like that. It's just going to be a shed. Not glamorous from the outside. But what will we do in the shed? Strategic programming. How do you draw people's attention to you? the good people, the people you want to support you, not the trolls who will sell you before breakfast. How are you going to put out the good stories and give them ways of understanding and enjoying the significance of place? I started with the garden when I arrived at Carrick Hill, and I've gone back to it. we have begun work on the collections. So one of the great things that happens each year at Carrick Hill, after we reopen from the end of July, is August is the Camellia Society's show. And they pick the blooms from the bushes and they put them in an egg cup of water, 6 of each that they're showing, in serried ranks. So instead of having you dine at those tables, there will be rows upon rows of perfect pink, crimson, red, white, and that other thing. Not tessellated, variegated, all that stuff. It's pretty ordinary in terms of visual display, and it's absolutely fascinating if you like camellias. Well, 1,200 people come that weekend to see the camellias. 1,200 people on a wet August weekend come to see the camellias. We're not quite the Chelsea Flower Show, as Edward Borden's showing us here, but it's the same phenomena. And we have a Lilium Society and an Orchid Society and a Succulent Society, a Rare Fruit Society, a Rhododendron Society. There are other societies. They're still alive and well and they're doing their thing. Roses and dahlias have been offered to us, unique collections of, just as we were offered the Alistair Clark Rose Collection. Will we accept them? There's some policy issues there. But I would have in a garden shed the opportunity, about this size actually, Ed, could I have this shipped across to Carrick Hill? This would be perfect. A facility where flower shows can happen. So pleasing, isn't it? Could be black inside the shed, couldn't it? With the tools behind curtains, and you open the curtains and discover them. The other thing that can happen is that people like gardening and they want to know how you do it. When they go into the orchard, they say, what's going to happen to the fruit? Where did you get the apples from? Lola, who lives up here in the hills, published this book. Is she in her 80s? Where's Caroline? She's coming to see us in about a week's time. This is the largest selling book. I think it's in its 3rd impression of Wakefield Press. It inspired me at home. I'm not a big gardener, incidentally. I like to sit and read a book about it. I don't actually like doing it. I'm what Peter Watts calls an armchair gardener. Others can do the graft, but I built myself a little metre-square tub, and I've got to tell you, I put the broad beans in too late. They're all horrible. The strawberries are eaten by birds. The tomatoes won't produce a crop until, it's a disaster. But actually, I like it. I like trying to fight nature. One day I'll work out how to work with her. But Lola is my Bible. She tells me what to plant, or when, and how to keep. It's the doing of it. We have a little garden at the moment, Peter Rabbit's garden, but there are other opportunities for teaching and workshops and demonstrations. We've already connected the cooks in the cafe to the gardeners, and the zucchini flowers on the menu are sensational. We've had to give up a little bit of the cutting beds for the gardens for them, but we may well move towards some sort of recreation of our productive garden just below the nuttery. As you know from Stephanie Alexander and a number of other chefs and teachers, the connect between children and cooking and the food source is increased. Now, Botanic Gardens is forging ahead with a great project there. So we'll actually be on the fringes of that. We'll be on the fringes of it. We'll settle for organic gardening or cooking with pulses, or just when the apples come good. We'll respond. We won't compete. But I must tell you about strategic partnerships. You can get very posh with the food thing, not just zucchini, flowers and apples. My neighbour at the Waite actually can grow truffles because they have exactly the right oak tree. In fact, she doesn't grow truffles. She sends the acorns to a man in Victoria who is into sustainable food production, and he impregnates the germinated acorns with the right, oh, I've got to get this right, fungus that actually produces the truffle. And they had a truffle dinner produced from the trees, from the acorns at their site, grown in Victoria. Now that's special. And so was the price, let me tell you. $340 for a single, $680 for a double. It better be good. But you have to compete for it. So let's just, oh, and there we are. Community effort. We're picking apples in the orchard. There's Andrew Durham there. Look, there's one of, where's Durham? There's Durham, look. With the dog. The point of all of this is saying you can't actually do it all on your own. You've heard about the plant groups. You actually need some strategic alliances. And because we're all cannibals. We eat each other's audiences. It's perfectly all right. It won't do you any harm. In fact, it might do you a lot of good. Alliances with others. We've heard quite a lot of this. You can't go it alone. You can't take the risk entirely by yourself. Besides, there may be a specialist group that's actually going to value add what you're doing. And I can't stress enough. Here we have a cider maker involved from the Basket Rangers, yet to see a bottle of cider. He took all those apples there and crushed them. On the other hand, he did send us half a dozen bottles he made from another source. And yes. No, but as the chef said, it doesn't matter. As long as they're in the bottles, we can put them up on the shelves. It'll be good. Cider is such a reinvented drink. Have you noticed? Such a reinvented drink. Oh, come on. I'm just going to Italy, Andrew. So some of us are tragics. So the women come because they're at ease with the gardening. They're at ease with the collection in the house. They love decorative arts. They like to be in a place, to be at their ease, a sense of grandeur, and not. Men are a bit holdy-backy. How did Peter Hyson say the other day? I have to have the caravan and the car in there that my grandfather used so that the men have got something to look at and kick the tires of. So we're in Italy for Margaret's special anniversary on Lake Como, and we're going to Villa Carlotta, which we used to be on the Grand Tour, you know all about this. It's got some very special collections and wonderful interiors. And a garden. I was allowed 2 gardens this day. I'm only going to tell you about one. And, you know, Margaret's a thorough person, researches, knows how to keep a man happy who's suppressed almost all his desires. Led me up the garden path. Goodness knows what was at the end of the garden path. A tool museum. On all the tools used Villa Carlotta on the production of grapes and winemaking. I just salivated. It was sensational. Tucked away at the back. So it hit a note with me. I'm perfectly at ease in historic houses with decorative arts collections. I love formal gardens, any kind of garden actually. I'll go and sit and read a book if it doesn't interest me. But it got me in. Our risk factor is, can we sustain the interest of the male visitor? Can we get them to come back again and again? Our 762 tools and old mold story about every single one of them and how we interpret them enough to provoke return visitors. I believe we are. We're going to do it. I've half got the board convinced too. The business manager's wondering how we're going to make a revenue line out of it, but the first thing is not to lose money, not to let it cost you. I can get it built, I can get it installed, I can get the program up. How will it return a dividend? When I talk to the 2 very competent administrators who look after our wedding business, trying to tell them what was happening, that we might have another wedding site, because the tool museum was going to be down here, they said, well, what about the tool museum? Can brides get married in it? I got a bit blokey and I thought, no, that's not the idea at all. If it's wet outside, we'll let them in, because, you know, that's what we have to do we sell a garden wedding. You can't come in the house for your wedding unless it rains. So we already have got the team thinking about how this facility, how this strategic program of talks and lectures and demonstrations and workshops and tour groups can come in from the wet or the hot sun, have their first cup of tea. We have nowhere for groups to assemble, where they could do it in a collection. to do with the significance of our place, the gardening of the place, the use of the hand tool, the last hurrah of the Edwardian vision of craftsmanship in the garden. We don't cut with cylinder mowers anymore. We can't get those wonderful Wembley stripes. If I can't have the Wembley stripe, I'm not going to put the tennis court back. I've got a cylinder mower that needs to be taken to pieces and rebuilt. I bet there's a volunteer group that can do that. It's got to be in working order. The first time we cut the grass will be a media event. And when Leighton Hewitt comes back and says, I'm not going to play on that, and I don't mean the mower, I mean the lawn court, we'll get him to quote it. And then we'll get a sponsor to help us have drought-resistant turf and water-wise management of it. We won't forget the quirky in all of this, which is why I've got gnomes and my favourite tire swan. And I have to do homage to James, because it was reading your faux entry in the Garden History Companion that set me thinking, when I came to South Australia, this is a state that must have them extant. It's an endangered species, you know. So, what has all this come from? It's come from research. It's come from understanding your story, and when you've finished it, go back and start again. Don Aldridge, who was a mentor of mine, I met him at the conference, in Interpretation Australia conference in Sydney. We became firm friends because we talked for about 2 hours about the picturesque, said to me, the most important thing is that you spend twice as long researching what you're going to do as doing it, because you'll only get one chance. And when I finished the Attingham Summer School, sorry Andrew, I have to tell this, I then was a glutton for punishment. I went for a 10-day tour with Don, who lived in Scotland. That'll be Jay Weatherall for me. He wants to fund one of these at Carrick Hill. I know he does. Between gardens, Don played Bach's Goldberg Variations. And he said, we'll just have another as we move to the next garden. And I said, of course, at the end of the tour, I said, Don, why have you been playing Goldberg Variations? Is there for people who have insomnia? He said, yes, but the more important thing is theme and variation. Theme and variation. We've probably all discovered our theme, the thing we believe the house or the garden or them both can do. But that doesn't mean to say with a little extra effort you can't find the variation that switches it on for the people you want to get in next, while sustaining the very thing you did in the first place to attract their attention. And if you depart, the other thing he said, if you depart from significance and the commitment to conservation, all is lost. You're on the slippery slope to entertainment. Thank you very much.
Well done, Rich. Thank you. And don't apologise. You were pretty spot on time. We started late. And I did like the way that Eartha Kitt sort of morphed gradually into Fenella Fielding. Well,